Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and this episode is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 170 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. When we think about slavery and its practice in the Atlantic world, our minds almost always take us to southern states like Virginia or South Carolina, or even out into the Caribbean, places where enslaved people lived and worked on plantations. Therefore, it may be surprising for many of us to know that New England, a place with no cash crops or plantations, a place where many of its earliest settlers came to live so that they could worship their Puritan faith in peace, and a place that became known for its strong anti-slavery sentiment during the 19th century, also has a long, deep slave past. So, why did New Englanders practice slavery, and just how far back does its slave past go? These are questions our guest Wendy Warren will help us explore. Wendy is an assistant professor of history at Princeton University and the author of New England Bound: Slavery and Colonization in Early America, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2017. Now, as we investigate New England's slave past, Wendy reveals the origins of the African slave trade and why American colonists preferred enslaved labor to free labor, when and how New England adopted the practice of slavery, and details about how enslaved people lived and worked in early New England. But first, have you signed up for the Ben Franklin's World listener newsletter yet? If you haven't, you really should, because this weekly email will notify you about new episodes by placing their show notes right in your inbox. Plus, every once in a while, I use the newsletter to send you timely messages about events and news of interest, and the newsletter is also your gateway to our private listener community on Facebook. When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll automatically receive our special link to join the Facebook group. Signing up for the newsletter is easy. All you need to do is text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com. All right, are you ready to explore slavery in early New England and see just how far back New England's slave past goes? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an assistant professor of history at Princeton University. She's fascinated by the day-to-day practice of colonization and in the negotiations and conflict that existed between would-be rulers and the unruly. Today, she joins us to discuss how slavery worked in the fledgling colonies of New England, with information from her Pulitzer Prize-finalist book, New England Bound: Slavery and Colonization in Early America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Wendy Warren.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Now, at the start of New England Bound, Wendy notes that between the 16th and 19th centuries, nearly 13 million Africans were enslaved and shipped to North and South America. Wendy, before we explore New England's involvement in the slave trade, would you tell us a bit about the African slave trade and how it started?
Well, that's a pretty big question, but essentially the African slave trade to the Americas rises in parallel with the development of cash crops and the extractive enterprises that benefit from the presence of enslaved labor like gold mining or silver mining. So in the first decades of European colonization, the economic situation, you might say, is typified by plunder and trade. It's a little more ad hoc. But once Europeans developed cash crops, then the focus of colonial efforts becomes production, really the use of land to produce things that can make profits. And once that happens, then you might want enslaved labor to produce commodities that will bring that kind of wealth. And in fact, scholars like David Eltis have tracked the growth of the Atlantic slave trade pretty neatly to the rise of commodity production. So when I use a term like commodity production, that's pretty dry. And like a lot of dry terms, I think it hides all sorts of processes. In this case, it's hiding the process of colonization because you can't grow a commodity to sell at a profit to create wealth without having land to do it on. And that land comes through the process of settler colonization, which is, in a nutshell, the removal of indigenous people from a location and replacing them with other people who might do the labor required to make that wealth. Or you could subjugate the indigenous people themselves. And either way, it's a story of replacement of, say, one way of life with another And in this book, I call that a deadly symbiosis. And I think what's interesting is that the deadly symbiosis happens even in a place like New England, which is such a peripheral market for the Atlantic slave trade.
Why enslaved labor? Why did early American colonists want enslaved labor to produce these cash crops instead of just using and hiring free labor?
Well, free labor is pretty expensive. And in the case of a cash crop like sugar, which, many historians have eventually argued drives sort of the English Empire, early modern English Empire, it's really deadly, and you can't get free labor to do that kind of work. So enslaved labor fits the bill. You can coerce people into working in a situation where the mortality rates are really pretty gruesome. And that isn't something you can get free labor to do eventually.
Now, in the years between 1620 and 1640, there was a great migration that took place to New England. And this great migration was a very different type of migration than the forced migration of African peoples to the Americas. Wendy, would you tell us about the Great Migration to New England?
So the Great Migration, what scholars of New England history call the Great Migration, is this sort of 2 decades when more than 20,000 English colonists come to the northeastern coast of North America, and they found in quick succession the colonies that they will jointly call New England. So you get in 1620, famously Plymouth. In 1630, you get the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 36, you get Connecticut and Rhode Island. In 37, you get the New Haven Colony. And this is a very sort of famous story of a huge mass of people coming across the Atlantic Ocean. It's not really the story of New England bound, but what is interesting is that it happens at the same time that there's a sort of terrible migration, a coerced migration going on across the Atlantic world, going the same direction, coming west across the Atlantic. And so that's the story of New England bound. Now, the Great Migration happens before, say, the sugar boom in the Caribbean, but it's an interesting story of 2 migrations.
This may be surprising for many of us to know, but the history of New England is deeply intertwined with the history of chattel slavery. Wendy, would you tell us when and how New Englanders began to adopt slavery? And would you tell us about the earliest forms of slavery they practiced?
Slavery is there really early in New England, earlier than I thought I would find. So if you take a famous story like, the Mayflower Pilgrims coming to Plymouth, the story is that they struggle through their first long winter, 1620, at the rudimentary outpost that they build on sort of the western shore of Cape Cod Bay. And then, fortuitously, this man named Squanto or Tisquantum approaches them and shows them how to find food and game. And, the question arises, how did they speak to each other? How did Squanto speak to these pilgrims? And the answer has to do with enslavement, and that in 1614, he had actually been kidnapped by an English captain named Thomas Hunt, along with, I think, 23 other Native Americans, and had been taken to Spain and sold into slavery there. And Squanto, at least, I don't know about the 23 others, proved himself pretty adept at navigating the Atlantic world. He somehow ends up in England, and somehow there, presumably a ship captain identifies him as someone from New England and puts him on board to serve as a translator to go back to New England and sort of work in the fishing industry, presumably, or help with something. He's going to work as an interpreter. So he gets back to New England and goes back to his village where he finds that everyone has died of smallpox, sort of typical outcome of colonization in the 17th century. And that is why he approaches the Pilgrims, and he speaks to them in English because he's been enslaved and has sort of made his way through the Atlantic world. So that's one example of slavery appearing even at the sort of most mythical of origin stories of New England. But leaving aside that sort of well-known story, in 1638, we start getting evidence that enslaved people are in New England. So John Winthrop writes in his journal in 1638 that the ship Desire, which is based out of Salem, has taken enslaved Indians from the Pequot War, captive Indians, and has taken them down to the West Indies and sold them into slavery there, and has brought back, in Winthrop's word, Negroes. So enslaved Africans have come already in 1638, and enslaved Indians have been sold out of the region. So this is sort of the first evidence of a round-trip slave voyage. And then in 1638 also is a story that I found very touching and compelling of a man named Samuel Maverick, who was an Anglican colonist. He owned 3 enslaved Africans on an island in Boston's harbor, Noddle's Island. And a passing traveler named John Jocelyn stayed with Maverick. And while he was there, one of the enslaved Africans that Maverick owned, a woman, came to Jocelyn's window in the morning and complained that she had been raped by another enslaved man on Maverick's orders so that Maverick could have, quote, a breed of Negroes. And that story is very early at 1638. As I said, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is only founded in 1630. So you asked about the earliest forms of slavery. I mean, the earliest forms of slavery, the enslavement of Indians, the exportation of Indians, and the sort of attempts to breed, these are all happening right away. Not extensively, to be sure, but they're happening.
This seems really surprising because when we think of the people of New England, we know that by and large, they were people that held deep Protestant religious convictions. So how did these New England Protestants justify enslaving Native Americans and then African men and women? I mean, how did they reconcile their practice of slavery with their religion?
So there's no general English aversion to slave trading and slave owning. But, the question is, do the Puritans in particular disapprove of it? And none of the records suggest that they do. As early as 1617, you can find sermons, but even earlier, of Puritan sort of theologians describing various forms of servitude, saying things like, some people are born to ride horseback and others to walk. So this idea of a natural hierarchy makes sense to early modern people, Puritans included, that some people would be in bondage and some people not. This is not shocking to anyone. And indeed, it seems to make sense in a world that's based on hierarchy with God at the top. It makes sense that some people sort of would be at the bottom, so to speak. So there's no problem for Calvinists or anyone else with the idea of a hierarchical world. And slavery is legitimate for Protestant theology.
Earlier, you told us the story of Samuel Maverick's enslaved woman who complained to traveler John Jocelyn that she had been raped because Maverick wanted to breed his own people to enslave. Which makes me wonder, did African slavery always coexist with Indian slavery in New England? Or did African slavery eventually supplant the practice of Native American slavery in the region?
So Indian slavery and African slavery clearly coexisted throughout the 17th century. Enslaved people in New England, one justification for them is that they're caught in just wars. They're taken captive in just wars. And so Native American captives from New England who are taken captive while fighting against the English, they are considered captives caught in a just war and are thus enslavable. But the problem is if you've captured someone in a war, you might not want to keep them and put them into domestic servitude in your own house or in your own town. And so a lot of the men are sold into the West Indies or elsewhere. But some of the women, children, some men actually do stay in the region and serve in some sort of state of unfreedom. It's unclear exactly if they're considered fully chattel slaves or what the state of unfreedom is. Margaret Newell, after New England Bound came out, she wrote a good book on Indian slavery in New England where she argues that there are enslaved Indians throughout the region, but their status is a little unclear as regard to, if their children are enslaved, if the status is inheritable in the same way that enslaved Africans are. But certainly Indian bondage is all over New England.
So what did slavery as an institution look like in early New England? I mean, when we think about slavery, we usually think about how it was practiced in the southern colonies like Virginia and South Carolina, or even in Caribbean colonies like Jamaica and Barbados. These were colonies with plantations. So how did New Englanders practice slavery? Because I have to imagine that it must have been very different.
Well, enslaved labor in New England was different than, say, the more talked about plantation style of labor in that it wasn't exactly racially differentiated from the labor that a colonist was doing. That is to say, an enslaved African in New England wasn't in a tobacco field, wasn't growing sugar, was doing instead the labor of a colonist. Many of these people lived, were sort of the only enslaved person in a household, and they did the labor that colonial household needed done, washing, farming, gardening, cutting down wood, the things that colonists needed in order to create a successful settlement. So it isn't a racialized labor system precisely, and as a result, the labor of slavery in New England can seem a little bit invisible because they didn't do work that was different than their owners or than the English. Like I said, they hauled water and cut trees and worked in warehouses and cooked. And I think that it's worth considering that they did this because this is a very precarious moment for the English in the area. It's the moment when the colonies are being settled, and there were specific needs on the ground at that moment for specific kinds of labor. And that's interesting to me. We often think of this sort of Atlantic system as this huge spiral of movement and trade and energy of people. I think it's worth remembering that at some point in that huge spiral of movement, that people ended up in specific moments and specific times. And in 17th century New England, the labor needs of that specific place and time were the work of settler colonization, were very mundane tasks. There's this case of a man named Juan, or called Juan. He's an enslaved African man who works in Salem, and he goes out one day with horses and a cart to gather some firewood, and the horses bolt, and he only recovers them from a swamp with great difficulty. They've really been spooked. And the reason he decides they bolted, he and some witnesses agree, is that they were scared by a witch. So this is a prime example to me of what slavery could look like in 17th century New England. This man whose name or whatever he's called is not an English name, Juan, and he is almost certainly not from the region, but he's ended up captive somehow in New England. And what does he spend his days doing, or at least some of his days? He gathers firewood for an average farmer in Salem. So one of the most violent institutions in world history, the Atlantic slave trade, has grabbed this man, has uprooted his life, and has dumped him in Salem, a small town, where he sees the most local phenomenon, witches. So he lives in the Salem that we're familiar with, this New England town that is haunted by witches. But he's also in the Salem of the Atlantic world, which is a bustling port town where Africans could labor alongside English people doing the work of colonial settlement. And he's a sort of coerced colonist. I think it complicates our understanding of African American history to think of Juan so early in North America doing this sort of labor. I think African American history to my students can seem a very static thing before the Civil War. They have this sort of static image of people laboring in cotton fields. But in fact, African American history is really long and deep in the country, and it includes people like Juan, who end up in Salem.
Just how many enslaved people did New Englanders import to do these mundane tasks associated with settler colonialism? Or, the type of work that goes into creating new, largely self-sufficient towns and settlements?
It's not many. That's the other thing that interested me about New England. It was the chance to consider what slavery was like in a place where there weren't many slaves. So I think at the turn of the century, the estimates are that there are about 2,500 enslaved people. That's not many, maybe as many as 4,000, but not many at all. 5% of the population. But that's intriguing to me because it suggests that their life was very different than you might find in a place like Barbados, for example.
Given that so few enslaved people lived in early New England, what was life like for those enslaved people who did live in the region?
Like I said, they do the labor that a colonist would do. I think sometimes they're working alongside owners. Sometimes they're out in the fields doing, tasks assigned to them. Sometimes they're working in warehouses. In a town like Boston, they might be doing the work of an urban center. They're doing all sorts of things. Probate records suggest they sleep in attics, so they sleep in the same structure as their owners. But the records are a little terse about that sort of thing, but that seems to be what's happening. And their lives are isolated at moments. Maybe not as much if they lived in a town, but if they were out on a farm, it could be very isolating.
Were there big differences in the lives of enslaved people in early New England, like between those who lived in port towns like Boston or Salem and those who lived in more rural areas like those we'd find in northern and western Massachusetts?
I mean, there must have been, right? So by the end of the century, we have Cotton Mather writing up rules about how enslaved Africans, or just Africans in general, should behave in the town. And he says things like you can't gather after dark, you can't corral, essentially. And that suggests that there was a community that people could find and that they did do things like meet after dark and walk the streets, etc. But if you were out on a farm, of course, your life must have been very different indeed and must have felt very lonely. The records don't tell us that, unfortunately. They don't allow for that kind of comparison, but it seems clear that your life must have been quite different.
You noted that probate records indicate that a lot of New England slaves slept in the attics of their masters' homes. And after we talk about our sponsor for a moment, I'd like for us to explore whether enslaved people in early New England were able to have informed families, given the fact that they often lived inside the homes of their owners. We've been exploring the practice of slavery in colonial New England, and one key piece of information we've discovered thus far is that the practice of slavery looked very different in colonial New England than it did in other places that grew cash crops, or crops colonists produced more for their commercial value than for their own use. Now, one of the biggest cash crops in British North America was tobacco, while sugar became absolutely huge in the wider Atlantic world. Would you like to know more about these cash crops and why they proved so popular during the 17th and 18th centuries? Visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Sign up for the free trial that they're offering you, and check out the Great Courses Plus course, Food, A Cultural Culinary History. Professor Ken Abala will take you through the history of human civilization to show you just how food has shaped everything from war, trade, politics, and art to even religion over time. In Food, A Cultural Culinary History, you'll find a 30-minute video called Dutch Treat, Coffee, Tea, Sugar, Tobacco, where Professor Abala discusses how the trade in exotic foods like tobacco and sugar gave rise to European colonial empires and to the spread and use of African slavery. The Great Courses Plus will even help you move beyond the subject of history too if you want, because it has over 8,500 lectures in its vast library of courses that will help you satisfy your curiosity about so many different subjects, like math, science, psychology, and even about how to perform new skills, such as cooking, photography, and speaking a new language. All of these fascinating lectures are presented by award-winning professors and experts, in easy-to-watch 30-minute long videos that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices. So visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld to extend your exploration of history and to dive into new topics that simply fascinate you. To claim your free trial of The Great Courses Plus, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Wendy, were enslaved people in early New England able to have informed families given the fact that they often lived inside their owners' homes?
It's clear that, people seek community, and so people found community. It was harder, if you're living alone in your owner's home, it was harder to form a community than it might have been on a plantation where there are large holdings. But we know from various court records that people did form some sort of liaisons. Fornication records, for example, show us that enslaved women became pregnant, which suggests they had relationships. Now, some of these relationships may have been coerced, but sometimes maybe not. Sometimes they name fathers who are servants, English servants, or enslaved African men. So certainly there's evidence that we have that people formed friendships and community. But we also have, pretty striking evidence that some people were very lonely. There's a case in the 1660s, I think, in Cambridge of this woman called Hagar, who's caught in one of these fornication trials. Like many women, she can't hide that something has happened because she's pregnant and her body is showing the evidence of this supposed crime. And they call her before the court. They want to know who the father of the child is. And she stands there before the court and says, well, essentially, you have your concerns about this fornication charge, but I want to say that 3 years ago I was taken from my husband and child in West Africa. She says, my child that sucked at my breast, or something very close to that, and taken to Barbados, and then eventually here to New England. And that's the crime she wants to address in front of this court. It's not at all the charge of fornication. You get the feeling she doesn't care about that. She wants to talk about this kidnapping 3 years ago that has uprooted her life. And you could do a lot with that kind of record. You could talk about, court practices. You could talk about the court itself. But what I thought was interesting was to center her opinion of what had happened and to sort of delve into the loneliness she's expressing and the sorrow about this child, this nursing child she had left behind in Africa. And also to sort of give credit to the courage she felt. She's standing in this court speaking a language that's not her first language, clearly. She says she's from Africa. And instead of caring about what the magistrate is asking her, she launches her own accusation. That takes no small amount of fortitude, given she knows the violence of the system if she's been to Barbados. It takes an immense amount of courage to do what she did. And it speaks to, I think, an immense well of loneliness and isolation that hasn't been assuaged by whatever relationship she had that made her become pregnant. And when the records say things like that, I found it very compelling, very touching and compelling. Just as when Mr. Maverick's, enslaved woman spoke to a passing stranger and said, hey, this isn't right. That's a courageous act in itself.
We can find other compelling and touching moments in Wendy's book, New England Bound, such as when she discusses what happened to enslaved men and women when they became older and unable to perform the heavier tasks of settler colonialism. Wendy, would you tell us about elder care for enslaved people and why colonies like Connecticut passed laws in regard to elder care for enslaved people?
The story I'm thinking of as you ask that question is of this man named John Wan, who lived in New Haven in the 17th century. And he has a fascinating story. His story is a little bit rare in that I think there were 20 documents related to the story, which for me was a gold mine of evidence. Most of the people I talk about in this book, they're in a fragment of a sentence. They're mentioned tangentially. They're rarely the extreme focus of the document I'm looking at. But in this case, John Juan, because he did something unusual, became the focus of a court case that went on. And it was a story of what an enslaved person does when they age. So basically, the story is that he was owned by the governor of New Haven Colony, Theophilus Eaton. But when Eaton died, John Juan's life became disrupted. So when Eaton was alive, John Juan, and in the records they call her his wife, asked the governor if they can have a little bit of land and a house to live in and sort of live separately. They seem to be asking basically for a sort of retirement deal, and they'll work as best as they're able for the governor, but they'll also live separately and independently. And the governor agrees, apparently, according to the records, and he gives them a little plot of land and a house. And they move to this house where they work, according to the governor's daughter, 3 days a week for the governor, 3 days a week for themselves, and then the seventh day is, of course, for the Lord. So this happens, and it seems to be going well, and then the governor dies, and so does his wife, and John Juan becomes, according to the governor's daughter, her property, as well as the house and land they live on. And then John Juan's wife dies. And John Juan gets the idea that he should sell this land and house and go to New York to live. This, to the governor's daughter, is an untenable idea because she insists that she owns both the land and Juan himself. She insists over and over in the records that he's the governor's slave and her slave now, too. But John Juan seems to have other ideas. He seems to believe himself to be free and that he owns the land. And we know this because he tries to sell the land to various neighbors, and then they get caught up in this court case involving legitimacy of this land sale. But what's interesting about it, already this story is interesting in that this man is navigating the colonial sort of real estate process pretty ably. That's interesting in itself. But what's really interesting is this one document I found in which he's explaining to a neighbor that he wants to sell the land to the neighbor. And the neighbor says, "Why would you sell the land?" He says something like, "You're an old man. You should just stay put. Why would you go off to New York at your age? That seems dangerous and unsafe." And John Juan replies to him, and this is a quote, "If he should get sick, nobody would comfort him. And so he would go to live with his country folk." And I just remember reading that. I remember reading it. It was in the Connecticut State Library. And I remember reading those words and just sort of gasping because of the poignancy, the very human nature of that statement, right? If he should be sick, nobody would comfort him. And I remember when I read it thinking, I don't think I've ever read a better definition of family. The people who will take care of you when you're sick, the people who will comfort you when you're sick. And what's interesting is Juan, who by that point had lived, many decades in New Haven, looked around, and in his old age, he said, "I don't have any family here. Nobody will comfort me when I'm sick," even though he had lived there that long. And I think that his story is interesting because it tells us how, at least one enslaved person felt about enslavement in New England, that it wasn't at all protective or pleasant or appealing, and that ultimately nobody was going to really care for him. There weren't any bonds of affection tying him to this place where he had lived for so long. These records, sometimes a line like that, "If he should get sick, nobody would comfort him," they just jump out at you because that one's only twice mediated, through the transcriber and the memory of the witness. And you can almost hear this enslaved man speaking. It's really very poignant and also so human. As I said, so your question was about old age. When enslaved people aged, as property, they depreciated. And the cruelty of a system that commodifies humans is that they became less valuable. And he sort of addresses that directly with his actions and his words.
Earlier we talked about what it was like to work as an enslaved person on a plantation. And although early New England didn't have any cash crops to tend, it still sounds like slavery in early New England was a brutal system. The stories we've heard throughout our conversation really reflect the lives of enslaved people as being very isolated and lonely.
Yeah, I think that loneliness is a real feeling. I wouldn't want to suggest that it wasn't at times also a brutal system. There are cases where enslaved people commit suicide. We know that enslaved people in New England stole food a lot, suggesting that they were hungry. We have cases of the beatings of slaves. We know that some enslaved people set fire to their owners' homes. And all of these actions suggest, at the very least, although they certainly don't prove, that enslavement in New England could be and was rough on people. Certainly Mr. Maverick's slave woman says that explicitly. She says she's being treated in a brutal way. And the woman who testifies in the Cambridge court about having been stolen from her child that sucked at her breast, she's telling us that enslavement in New England is rough. But certainly also the loneliness. And people have talked about this elsewhere, right? Where you have small holdings, the lack of community must have taken some sort of toll. The trick really is that the records don't tell us what that toll was. And, no matter how closely you listen, some things you'll never be able to know. But you can ask questions. You can listen to people like John Wan, and then you can just ask questions so that your reader wonders, too, what it would feel like to be alone, to have been kidnapped and end up in a place like New England.
You just noted that some enslaved people set fire to their owners' homes. So I wonder, in what other ways did enslaved people in New England resist their enslavement?
I think resistance is a little bit of an opaque category for a lot of people. I mean, it's hard to know when someone is resisting and when someone is living and what it means to label some things resistance. But certainly we see that people ran away from their owners, not infrequently. We see, as I said, rules being made about enslaved people needing to be in their homes at night, not walking around. And the rules suggest that they were, in fact, walking around at night and gathering. We see people, as I've already said, protesting in their own words their enslavement. The records, I should say, describe people doing suspicious actions like linen suspiciously burning. The person who was supposed to be ironing it was an enslaved woman. And we see actions like that not infrequently that suggest that people were deploying, Jim Scott's weapons of the weak idea, the idea that people seek to improve their situation not through overt acts of rebellion, but small acts of defiance that give them a little bit more room to maneuver. Vince Brown makes an argument about the politics of enslavement, of how you negotiate the world of slavery. He says it's not about resistance per se, but about sort of the politics of making space for yourself.
We've been talking about slavery in early New England for some time now, and I never did ask, why New England? Why did you choose to uncover and recover New England's slave past in New England Bound?
So I was interested in the Puritans, like many people before me. This most traditional of stories attracted me. I found them really fascinating, this people of sort of deep introspection. But as I was researching Puritans, I thought I would write a women's history. I wasn't quite sure of what I encountered, as I said, the story of Mr. Maverick's enslaved woman. And that really gripped me. It gripped me in part because of my own ignorance at the time. I hadn't known that there were enslaved people there. But also sort of the grief, as I said, that she expressed gripped me. And I wanted to know more about how she had gotten there and what she did there and, other people like her. My book started with that story and my decision to sort of follow up on it as best I could. Like many history books, I think it just sort of developed organically, and I asked different questions than I would ever have predicted. If you had asked me, 2 years before it, what kind of book would I write? I don't think I would have said that I would have written New England Bound. But you have to follow where the questions lead, and that's where my questions led.
New England Bound is a really interesting story, and it's mostly an overlooked story because when history textbooks and other narratives discuss slavery in New England, they tend to focus on the intense anti-slavery sentiment that the region became known for during the 19th century when slavery had largely phased out of the region. Wendy, do we know when this anti-slavery sentiment started to form in New England? Did you happen to find anything about it in your research into the region's early history?
As the 19th century approached, we know that enslavement starts to, as you said, phase out. And the reasons for that slow death are many and convoluted. For sure, the sort of soaring rhetoric of the American Revolution resonated strongly with some New England colonists. And then, maybe more cynically or more materialist argument would say that the institution was never really the mainstay of the region's labor force, right? It was never a slave society. So it was easier to get rid of slavery there in conjunction with these sort of revolutionary Enlightenment ideals. But you could also say that much of the impulse toward anti-slavery in the region came from the agitation of freed and enslaved people themselves, who were by then some 5th, 6th, and 7th generation New Englanders. It ends with a whimper, not with a bang, with some legal cases declaring gradual emancipation laws. And then why the story sort of disappeared. I would say specialists always knew that there were enslaved people in New England, but it has never been the focus. For one thing, if you're going to study slavery, I can understand that you might go where there are many more slaves. That would be the southern colonies, not New England or even 19th century South. Also, it's true that for a long time, New England universities dominated scholarship, maybe, and so sort of through a self-protective measure, they didn't write about their own history negatively. There's a lot of reasons, maybe. The story of sort of New England's anti-slavery sentiment is stronger than the story of New England's earliest relationship with slavery.
Before we move into the time warp, you've noted throughout our conversation that the records you used were terse, that they don't tell us things or they don't provide information about that, and that 20 documents about John Juan constituted a veritable goldmine for your research. So what does it mean, and what is it like to research people like the enslaved of early New England who left behind so little by way of a written record and really had so few written records created about them? How did you go about uncovering these people's stories?
So the records are terse, right? In all of my research, I never found a record written by an enslaved person themselves. So they're always mediated, as some of the records I've described are. This is a kind of history that is not unique to this story, right? Women's historians, historians of marginalized people, historians of illiterate peasants in the Middle Ages. You have to really sort of read the records backwards, upside down, any way you can to sort of eke out these stories. It can be frustrating, but rewarding at the same time. I spent many days in archives finding no one, but some days I found a lot of people, and that was exciting. I think, as I said, it deepens the history of African Americans, but it also complicates the history of New England to know that, walking down the street of Boston, a colonist would have passed an enslaved African. To know that, King Philip's War, these wars that we know as regional colonial wars, had ties or were influenced by or affected by the Atlantic slave trade. I think all those stories matter. And so if you can gather these fragmentary records and sort of make enough dots, points of information, they form a picture. And I think that picture is really enlightening and important. And these people were people just like any others, and their histories deserve to be told.
Okay, let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if New England had found a cash crop and its slave population had been larger? How would the history of slavery in New England, British North America, and even in the early United States have been different?
I'm not very good at hypotheticals, but I mean, if New England had had a cash crop, it would have looked like other places with a cash crop. I imagine it would have had a much larger enslaved population, and it would have looked like, that kind of labor regime and that kind of culture would have developed. We know that when Puritans went to Providence Island, Karen Kupperman has told us that when they went to Providence Island, they imported enslaved Africans to grow tobacco. If Puritans in New England could have grown sugar or rice or tobacco, they would have imported large numbers of Africans to do so, I think. But your question was not only, how would New England have looked different, how would the history of the United States have looked different? I mean, there it gets very murky to predict, but, the Civil War seems to, the impetus, the sort of regional divisions wouldn't have existed. It would be very interesting. I don't know what would have happened. I think it would have been a very different trajectory for the United States.
Wendy, what are you researching and writing about now?
So right now I'm at work on a couple of projects, but the one right on my mind is about imprisonment in early America. I'm doing a recovery project of what imprisonment meant in the 17th and 18th centuries. So it's in addition to critical prison studies, sort of the rising wave of carceral studies, but rooted deeply in the colonial period and based, again, as a recovery act.
If we have questions about slavery in early New England, how can we contact you?
My Princeton website is the best way.
Wendy Warren, thank you for helping us better understand the practice of slavery in early New England.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Colonial New England didn't have cash crops or plantations, but it did have slavery. In fact, New Englanders began their practice of slavery not long after they settled the region. The Pilgrims established Plymouth in 1620, the Massachusetts Bay colonists settled Boston in 1630, and by 1638, we have records that indicate New Englanders like Samuel Maverick owned African slaves. So, how did the New England practice of slavery develop so quickly? As Wendy noted, in some ways, the existence of slavery in New England predated the English colonists who made the region their home. when other Englishmen came to the shores of New England and enslaved Native Americans. This is the reason that the Pilgrims could speak to Squanto or Tisquantum when they met him, because Englishman Thomas Hunt captured and enslaved Tisquantum in 1614 and brought him back to Europe where he learned to speak English. With this practice of Native American enslavement in place upon the colonists' arrival, it shouldn't be all that surprising for us to learn that New Englanders quickly got into the practice of enslaving Native Americans, especially during periods of warfare such as the Pequot War that took place between 1636 and 1637. Englishmen enslaved their war captives. But what do you do with a bunch of angry, defeated men when your labor needs require them to live and work inside your homes and on your farms? New Englanders answered this question by taking these war captives down to the Caribbean, where they either sold them outright or traded them for enslaved Africans. This was how African slavery came to New England. Now, New England never had many African slaves given that the region lacked cash crops and plantations. As Wendy revealed, it's likely that the region had between 2,500 and 4,000 slaves at the turn of the 18th century. Of course, this meant that with so few African men and women living among a burgeoning white population, that life was lonely and often difficult for enslaved people. And we can see and hear this loneliness and difficulty when we study the life of Hagar, the enslaved woman who, rather than answer the fornication charges against her, complained to the Cambridge court of the injustice of her kidnapping from Africa. Or in the story of John Juan, who tried to sell property he thought was his so he could move among the country folk of New York because there was no one left in New Haven to care for him when he became sick. Knowing about slavery as practiced in New England complicates what we know about the region's history. New England may have become a hotbed of anti-slavery sentiment during the 19th century, but during the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a society with slavery, and a region where few people held qualms about its practice. Look for more information about Wendy, her book New England Bound, plus notes for what we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/170. Don't forget to sign up for the Ben Franklin's World listener newsletter. It's really easy to do. Just text BF World to 33444. The Great Courses Plus offers more than 8,500 video lectures on a wide range of topics that can help you better understand everything from the history of food to how to speak a new language. So why not check out their vast course library with a free trial? To claim your free trial, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. Finally, did any aspect of our discussion about slavery and how it was practiced in colonial New England surprise you? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me at Liz Covart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.